The harbor smelled like diesel and old blood. It always did this late. When the fog came in off the water and the shipping containers stood in rows like tombstones nobody had bothered to mark. Cale Morrow moved through it the way he'd moved through everything for the past 6 years. Fast, quiet, with his hand resting on the inside of his jacket and his eyes tracking the shadows between the stacked steel. He'd been hired to intercept a courier. The courier worked for a man named Drac. Drac had killed Cale's brother when they were both 17, carved him up for parts and sold what was worth selling, and Cale had spent every year since closing the distance between the man he was, and the man he needed to be to finish it. Tonight was supposed to be the night. He heard the shots before he saw the muzzle flash, a scatter of small arms fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once, then the particular crack of a high-powered rifle from the elevated catwalk near berth 7. Cale pressed himself flat against the container wall and calculated quickly. 3 shooters at ground level, 1 elevated, all of them firing toward the water, not at him, something that had just arrived. He didn't understand what he was seeing at first. The light was too bright and too wrong. Not the yellow of a spotlight or the blue of a welding arc, but a clean white that seemed to come from inside the air itself. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then, it collapsed and something fell. He thought it was a person. Small, crumpled, hitting the dock planking with the boneless drop of someone who'd fallen a very long distance. He started moving toward them before he made the conscious decision to do it. Old reflex, pre-violence reflex, the one that remembered there were still things that mattered besides the job. He got 3 steps before he realized one of Drac's men had spotted him. The round caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him sideways. He managed to stay upright. Barely, to return fire with his right hand. 2 quick shots that put the man down and bought him enough space to reach the crumpled figure on the dock. He grabbed them by the collar. Female. Younger than he expected, maybe mid-20s, dark eyes that opened and focused on him with the immediate, assessing clarity of someone trained to wake up ready. She'd been shot. He could see the tear in the dark jacket over her ribs, the dark stain spreading. But she was breathing, she was looking at him and she was breathing. "We need to move," he said. She nodded. That was all. He got her to the safe house on the 4th floor of a building that used to be a textile warehouse. His shoulder burned. He wrapped it himself, then turned his attention to her wound and found, bewilderingly, that it had mostly stopped bleeding. Not healed, still raw, still deep. But the rate of blood loss was wrong. Like her body had protocols he didn't have words for. She waited until he'd finished the field dressing before she spoke. "You're Morrow," she said. It wasn't a question. "You know me. I know your file." She sat up slowly, wincing but sitting up. "From the archive, the one they compiled after." She stopped. "Started differently, Miss Kira. I came from somewhere you won't immediately believe. Try me." She did. He didn't believe her. Not for the first 12 minutes which he spent staring at the ceiling while she talked. Not for the next 4 during which she explained, with the flatness of someone who had told this story before and knew exactly how it landed, that in the year 2091 the last coordinated human military force on Earth numbered approximately 900 individuals and was losing territory at the rate of 11 kilometers per week. He believed her when she showed him the bracelet. It was a band of something that looked like tarnished copper, but moved like liquid when she tilted her wrist, and when she pressed the small node on its underside, time did something that was not supposed to be possible. His cup of water was mid-fall off the edge of the table. He'd knocked it over with his elbow, and then it wasn't falling anymore. It was simply there, a column of water suspended in air, the droplets hanging individual and separate as beads on a wire. Kira moved through the stopped moment with the economy of someone who'd had a great deal of practice, replaced the cup, and stepped back into position. Time resumed. The cup was upright. The water was inside it. Cale stared at the cup for a long moment. "All right," he said. Tell me the rest." The rest was this: 60 years from now, a deep space vessel of a species with no name that humans could pronounce. The soldiers of 2091 called them the Vreth, for the sound their communications made when decoded at low frequency would enter the solar system in apparent distress. The vessel would discharge a single escape pod before breaking apart in low orbit. The pod would land in a mountain range in the northern hemisphere, and the pilot inside, injured and frightened and completely alone on an alien world, would encounter a man named Drac. Drac would not be frightened. Drac would recognize an opportunity. He would capture the pilot, strip the escape pod for technology, and sell what he couldn't use. The Vreth fleet, receiving a distress signal and then receiving nothing at all, would draw the only conclusion available to a species that had never encountered deliberate cruelty before. They would assume their people were being held. They would come to retrieve them. "And we fought back," Cale said. "Of course we did." Kira said it without judgment. "We didn't know what they wanted. They didn't know how to tell us." The first engagement killed most of the European continent's orbital infrastructure in 11 minutes. After that it was. She pressed her mouth into a line. So it was what it was, so you came back to stop it. I came back to stop Drac from getting his hands on the pilot. She met his eyes steadily. Evie. The Vreth vessel will fall in approximately 72 hours. The escape pod will land in the Cathar mountain range, 900 kilometers north of here. Deeper. Drac has a retrieval team already positioned there. He doesn't know what's coming down yet, but he's been monitoring low-frequency anomalies in the orbital band for 3 months. When the pod lands, he'll have people on site within hours. How do you know all this? Because in my timeline we found Drac's operational logs in the ruins of his compound, after the war started, after there was nothing left to do about it. She looked at her hands, a brief private look, one that knew what ruins felt like. My people built the portal in 8 months. We didn't have resources for multiple attempts. I'm the attempt. Kale was quiet for a while. Outside, the harbor sounds continued. Water, steel, the distant plaint of a crane. He thought about his brother. He thought about the particular way Drac had looked at things he intended to own, the flat proprietary shine of that gaze. And killing Drac, he said. Dang, that's not enough. It might be. Probably it isn't. The pod will still land. Someone else could find it first. The pilot needs to survive, undisturbed, long enough to transmit a return signal to its fleet, just enough to let them know it's alive and not under duress. If the fleet receives that signal, they leave. No retrieval force, no first contact under the worst possible conditions. She paused. Not complicated. It's incredibly complicated. Yes, she conceded, but the core of it isn't. They left for the mountains before dawn. Drac's name kept surfacing in what they found along the way. A logistics hub disguised as a mining survey operation. 3 supply convoys moving north on routes that didn't appear on any registered commercial manifest. A communications relay that Kira identified by its frequency signature as a piece of Vreth technology Drac had gotten hold of before the pod had even landed. He has something already, she said, studying the relay from a hillside above the road. The wind pulled at her jacket. He'd stopped favoring her ribs sometime around the 3rd hour of driving, which continued to bother him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. A fragment, debris from the vessel's advance. That's how he's tracking the pod's trajectory. What's a fragment worth to someone like Drac? In my timeline, it was worth everything. Technologies we hadn't developed yet. Materials we didn't have synthesis pathways for. He sold pieces of it to 7 different governments and kept the rest. She lowered the scope. He understood the value of monopoly. Kale thought of the supply convoys. He thought of the particular way this operation had been layered. Visible enough that someone looking for it would find it. Invisible enough that no one would look. He recognized the architecture of it. He'd spent 6 years studying Drac's methods, and those methods had a texture. Patient, procedural, completely indifferent to what it cost the things in its way. He had my brother picked up because my brother saw something he wasn't supposed to see, Kale said. He hadn't said it out loud in a long time. A transaction. Some cargo being offloaded at the facility he worked at. Drac's people grabbed him within 24 hours. Kira didn't say she was sorry. He was grateful for that. He said, he operates the same way in my timeline's records. Eliminate the witness before the witness understands what they witnessed. It was my brother who didn't understand. I was the one who figured it out later. I was 17. He put the scope away. He's been living with that for 6 years and doesn't know it. Does that change what you have to do tonight? Kale considered the convoy dust rising in the distance. No. But it changes what it means. The pod landed at 0317. They were close enough to see it come down. A streak of orange across the stars. Disciplined, controlled. The trajectory of something built to survive re-entry rather than something falling. It hit a snowfield in the upper basin of the Cathar range and left a scar in the white that glowed faintly residual heat. Drac's team was 7 kilometers out when it landed. Kale knew this because Kira had spent the drive up mapping their communications. He had a device. Another piece of future engineering, small and flat and completely opaque to him, that translated the Vreth technology Drac was using as a relay into something readable. Team was well equipped. Moving fast, professional. They had 11 minutes. What followed was the kind of work Kale had gotten very good at and never talked about. 3 checkpoints. 4 personnel each, rearranging themselves for efficiency as the clock thinned. He moved the way his brother's death had trained him to move. Economically, without hesitation, aware that regret was a thing you were allowed to have afterward. Kira covered him with the particular focused calm of someone who had practiced violence so long it had become simply another language, spoken the same as any other. Teams. Checkpoint, he found Drac. Not the convoy, not the team. Drac himself, which Kira had not predicted, which meant he'd changed his protocols. He was standing at the edge of the snowfield with his hands in his coat pockets, and his head tilted up toward the glowing scar in the snowpack. And when he heard Kale's boots on the frozen ground, he turned around with an expression of mild surprise that settled quickly into something flat and evaluating. "Morrow," he said, "I heard you were moving in my direction." I assumed this was still about the brother. "It's about a few things. The girl?" He looked past Kale toward Kira without looking at her, the way he'd always looked at things that existed in categories below his threshold of interest. "She's interesting. The technology she's carrying is very interesting. I'd like to understand where she acquired it." "You're going to leave the basin," Kale said. "You and your people. You're going to leave the pod and whatever's in it completely alone. And then we're going to talk about the other thing." Drax smiled. It was a small, careful smile, the kind that was mostly just an arrangement of muscles. "And you don't have the leverage for that sentence. I know what's in the pod." The smile didn't waver. But something behind it shifted. "It's not a weapon," Kale said. "Not technology you can sell in pieces. It's a person who got separated from their people and is trying to get home. That's the entire content of that pod." He watched Drax's face process this. "If you touch it, we get the war you've been thinking about profiting from. Except you won't be in a position to profit." "Nobody will. You're asking me to leave a piece of alien technology in a snowfield. I'm telling you to." Drax looked at him for a long moment, the particular flat gaze that had looked at his editor and found him surplus, that had looked at everything in the world and asked only what use it might be. Then he looked at the pod. Then he reached into his coat. Kale shot him before the hand cleared the pocket. He did not hesitate. He had spent 6 years not hesitating for this specific moment, working toward the steadiness it required. It wasn't clean and it wasn't simple, and standing over what remained of it in the snow and the dark, he felt the full weight of all 6 years simultaneously, which was considerable. Kira was at his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She'd learned at some point in the war-compressed life that had made her, when silence was more useful than words. "People will fall back when they lose contact," she said finally. "I know. We have a few minutes." He nodded. He looked at the pod. It had stopped glowing by the time they reached it. The surface was warm under his hands. The warmth not of metal cooling, but of something living radiating heat, and there was a seam along one side that had clearly been designed to open from inside. Stood in front of it, the seam shifted. The panel separated. The pilot of the Vreth escape pod was at first glance nothing his mind had a category for. The bilateral symmetry, 4 limbs, a body that organized itself around a central axis. But the proportions were wrong in ways that took a moment to resolve from unsettling into simply different. The eyes were large and very dark and currently fixed on him with an intensity that communicated, across every possible barrier of biology and language and history, the exact state of being afraid in an unknown place. He thought of every way that fear could go wrong. He thought of Drax's hands in his coat. He thought of 60 years of war built from 11 minutes of misunderstanding. He crouched down, putting himself below the pilot's eye level, reducing himself, making the geometry of the encounter smaller. "Hey," he said. "You're okay." He didn't know if the pilot could parse the words. He didn't think the words were the point. Stayed low, stayed still, kept his hands where they could be seen, and watched the quality of attention in those dark eyes shift. Very slowly, the way light changes at the edge of dawn, from the rigid focus of something waiting to be struck to something more tentative, more alive. Kira crouched beside him. He had, it turned out, a very small device clipped inside her jacket that the engineers of 2091 had built specifically for this moment. A basic acoustic modulator designed to pick up Vreth communication frequencies and generate tonal responses that indicated non-aggression. She clicked it on. The sound it made was something between birdsong and radio static. Ikil would have found it absurd in any other context. The pilot went very still. Then it made a sound back. It went on like that for a while. Kira's device and the pilot exchanging tones in the frozen dark while the stars moved overhead and the snowfield absorbed the last of the pod's heat. Kale sat on the ground nearby and watched it happen and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the specific texture of a thing going right. At some point, the pilot reached out one of its limbs and touched his arm. Just touched it briefly. The way you might check to confirm that something was real. He didn't move. He let it confirm whatever it needed to confirm. "It's responding positively to the non-aggression pattern," Kira said quietly. "The modulator should be generating enough signal for the fleet transponder to pick up. They'll know the pilot is alive, uncoerced." She paused. "It'll take them about 3 hours to process the signal and adjust their approach vector. So we wait. He looked up at the sky. Stars were very clear up here, away from the harbor's light pollution, away from the city entirely. They were always there, of course. He just stopped looking. "In your timeline," he said. The war. Were there moments when it could have gone the other way?" Kira was quiet for a bit. The modulator continued its patient exchange. "There were moments," she said, "when people made different choices than they needed to. Drax was the first, not the last. She looked at her hands again, the same private look as before, knowing something about cost. But yes, the war had seams in it. Places where one decision differently made would have. She stopped. Would have meant you wouldn't have had to come back here. Yes, he thought about seams. He thought about the 6-year distance he'd traveled to reach a snowfield in the Cathar Range, sitting next to a woman who'd traveled 89 years to reach the same place, both of them having arrived in time. Or what was, from the perspective of 6 billion people who didn't know it yet, just barely in time. What happens to you, he asked, when they get the signal? When the fleet adjusts. The war doesn't happen. My timeline changes. She said it the way someone says something they've thought about long enough that the thinking has gone quiet. I'm not sure what that means for me specifically. The people who built the portal thought it meant I'd simply return to a version of 2091 that was different, better. She tilted her head back. That's a nice thought. You don't believe it. I believe it's a nice thought. A slight pause. I believe that what matters right now is that it's true, not what it means for me. The pilot made a sound. Tone. Not a modulated tone, something lower, something that the modulator didn't translate because it wasn't aimed at the machine. Kira listened to it carefully. It's asking something, she said. What? I think it's asking if we're going to be all right. She glanced at him sideways. I think the concept is roughly your kind, not you specifically. Kale looked at the pilot. At the dark, intelligent eyes that had been afraid and were less afraid now, that had crossed interstellar space in a damaged pod and ended up in a snowfield on an alien world and were still somehow curious enough to ask. Tell it yes, he said. Kira adjusted the modulator, sent the response. The pilot was quiet for a moment. Then it made the low sound again. Slower this time, drawn out, with a cadence that Kale would spend a long time afterward trying to find a word for. The closest he ever got was the word his grandmother had used for a particular kind of exhale. The sound a person makes when they've been holding their breath for a long time and have finally at last decided to put it down. The fleet's response signal arrived at 0641, Mountain Time, when the horizon was just beginning to decide it was morning. A blue light in the upper atmosphere that tracked from east to west in a clean arc and was gone so quickly that in a city you'd have taken it for a weather satellite. Kira saw it. He saw her see it. He was sitting against the pod hull, her eyes closed, and she opened them and looked at the arc, and she said quietly, "That's it." And then she was not there. Not dramatically, not with any light or sound. He was there, and then she wasn't, in the way that things in the past stop being present when the present moves on. No violence to it, just the ordinary miracle of time doing what time does. The pilot watched the space where she'd been, then it looked at Kale. That with it, until the Vreth retrieval craft came down an hour and 40 minutes later, vast and unhurried, its hull catching the new daylight and throwing it back in colors he had no names for. It descended into the basin without any drama, and figures came out of it, many of them, moving with the same bilateral efficiency as the pilot, and when the pilot saw them coming it moved past Kale, and toward them with a speed that surprised him. He stayed where he was. He watched the reunion happen, which was its own kind of translation. Not something he could fully read, but something he didn't need to read, because some things are apparent regardless of biology. One of the figures from the craft stopped near him, looked at him. He looked back. They stayed like that for a few seconds. 2 species in a snowfield in the early morning, both alive, both aware that this could have gone very differently. The figure made a sound. Kale didn't have a modulator. He didn't have any device that would make the exchange easier. He just looked at the figure and nodded, slowly once. The figure turned and walked back toward the craft. He drove back down the mountain as the sun came up, one-handed, his left shoulder aching in a way that was going to require actual attention, and let himself think about his brother for the first time in years, without the thinking being organized entirely around the point of Drac. He thought about the workshop his brother had kept in their parents' basement, the models, the particular way he'd looked at the sky when he was working through a problem, face angled up, mouth slightly open, like the answer might be written somewhere up there if you knew how to look. He thought he would have wanted to know. He would have wanted to see that retrieval craft in the morning light. He took the long road back to the harbor. The fog had burned off. The water was flat and bright, and from the right angle looked like it went on forever.